Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me loud and clear. Welcome to today's Immersive Labs live demo session. Thank you everyone for coming, and it's great to see everyone here. This time we'll be covering our latest in cloud security. So we'll be giving you a run through of what the labs look like, as well as some insights on our objectives when creating these labs. To quickly introduce myself, I'm Matt Parven. I'm a principal cloud security engineer in the content team here at Immersive Labs. So before we do begin, just going to quickly run over some housekeeping. So first of all, the session is being recorded, and the recording will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you do end up dropping out for any reason, you can always catch up later. As well as this, we'll be sending the recording link to anyone who is registered for the session. So again, you can watch it back at your leisure. We've got 30 minutes in total allotted for this webinar, and I'll make sure to leave some time at the end for questions. But do feel free at any time during the presentation to ask anything, and I'll keep an eye out for them and try and answer them as we go through, rather than leaving them all to the end. And this can be done in the questions box in the webinar panel. And if I do fail to get back to you with any of your questions, then I'll hopefully be able to email you after the session. This is a live webinar, as you can imagine, and like many live sessions, it could come down to things like broadband speed. So please bear with me if anything happens there. If anything happens on your end and you accidentally get logged out, just click the same link and you'll be able to rejoin the session. So first of all, before we start the demo of the lab, so cloud security. So in Immersive Labs, cloud security is a relatively new product, and it's something that we are kind of ramping up the labs for this quarter and next year. Obviously, cloud's continuing to grow, and this isn't going to stop, and more organizations are moving into the cloud. And obviously, protecting cloud-based systems, data, infrastructure is obviously extremely important for any business that's leveraging the cloud. So who's involved in it? So anyone working in the cloud, so traditional roles, cloud operations, infrastructure engineers, cloud security engineers, but also I think developers. I think cloud security is, in my opinion, shifting left to an extent. You've got developers who are using infrastructure as code, they're spinning up their own dev environments and things like that, utilizing various cloud services for their apps. And I think it's important for them to also know best practice security principles for that. So how can Immersive Labs help? So obviously, we're trying to equip users who are in these roles with the knowledge to build secure infrastructure, whether that's things like AWS, Azure, but also the associated tooling that you'd often find in the cloud. So things like containers, Kubernetes, etc., with hands-on practical labs. So in this demo, we're going to cover a little bit about what container security is, secure infrastructure as code, why it's important. We'll be covering the new labs and obviously demoing them as well. So it's probably worth saying in the labs that we've released, where we are kind of trying to teach secure principles of infrastructure as code, we are using Terraform. And these labs are designed, as I said, to enable best practice security principles using infrastructure as code, which can sometimes be hard to teach. A lot of the time, people are writing infrastructure as code, they're deploying their infrastructure, but they don't really know whether it's secure, whether they're following best practice, CIS benchmarks, and things like that. And obviously, we want to ensure that any deployed infrastructure is appropriately hardened and minimizes the attack surface. We don't want anything like posture drift is often a term used quite a lot, and compliancy violations and things like that. Again, who is this aimed at? So like I said in the previous slide, traditional infrastructure engineers, people in operations, security engineers, developers, but pretty much anyone who day-to-day may find themselves working with infrastructure as code. So if we go over now to the labs, hopefully you can see the Immersive Labs page here. So to find these labs, we just need to go to labs by category. We can see on the left here we've got cloud security. We just need to click that and you can see all of our current cloud security content. The focus of today's demo obviously being the secure Terraform and the container hardening series. In In regards to infrastructure as code, we've got 3 series, which are split by the actual platform they use. So we've got AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. Inside these series, you've got a number of labs. The first one being what is Terraform, which kind of explains infrastructure as code, why you would use it, the benefits of it, before then jumping into the hands-on practical labs that aim to teach you security principles using infrastructure as code. Each episode is different. They kind of build on each other, but the idea is the first episode being kind of the basics. So if you're used to AWS, we're talking about things like basic bucket policies, security groups, before moving on to more advanced topics. I say advanced, they're not necessarily complex, but things like key management, IAM policies, and things like that. If you are sort of completely new to infrastructure as code or Terraform, the first lab does kind of give you a good grounding of that, teaches you the basics of Terraform, as I've said. So if you are new, don't be too put off by it. And the labs themselves, fairly average difficulty. The info panel does explain quite a lot of it. So if I drop into the first episode, so this is episode 1. As you can see with the learning outcomes, discover vulnerabilities in your Terraform infrastructure as code, recognize and fix the insecure configurations, and gain experience developing secure AWS resources within Terraform. So if I go ahead and restart the lab, I have obviously completed this before. So the info panel talks you through Terraform, gives you a good kind of basic understanding or introduction to the different resource types, what these look like in Terraform, various input variables, before talking a little bit about what you're going to be securing in this lab. So server-side encryption, public access for your buckets and things like that. And then going on to talk a little bit about how the lab actually runs, so what you're going to be doing, which I'll show you when the lab loads. In this lab, we do give you some, what I would say, complete Terraform, but it's insecure in certain areas. So it deploys a range of buckets and security groups, and these have been insecurely kind of configured. So your job is to essentially fix the configurations, harden the Terraform, and then you complete the lab. So if you've completed any of our application security labs, it follows a similar kind of process. So you can see here on the left, we give you some Terraform, not overly complex. We don't want to overdo it by giving you like an ISO 27001 environment. We're just giving you some basic Terraform, deploy some buckets, some keys, some basic stuff here you'd see by default, like the VPC. And the idea is on the right here in this terminal, you're going to get some output from that Terraform, which will give you some security alerts, tell you the line number, and tell you the problem with the configuration. And then you need to then go in and fix those. At the top, you've got the verify button, which I'll run in a second, and you've also got reset. So if at any point you kind of make a mess of your Terraform, you can always just reset it back to its default state as it is here. And then you've also got a clear terminal button on the right. So if this gets messy at any point, or you just want to clean it up, you can always click that. So if we go ahead and verify this Terraform, it takes a couple of seconds and it will come back with some issues. For scanning this, we're using a number of open source tools. They're the sort of tools you'd often find in kind of like CI/CD pipelines for static code analysis. But we've also written our own internal tools as well to scan some areas that were missed in those tools. And we do also verify the Terraform to make sure that you haven't just deleted all the infrastructure to try and complete the lab. Because obviously, if there's no infrastructure being deployed, you may think that we're seeing that as there's no issues, but we do check that as well. So if we read some of the issues here, we've got 4 high issues, a medium issue, and some of our own validity results. So making sure that you've got descriptions and stuff like that set on some of the resources. So the first one here is ensure that S3 buckets have server-side encryption at rest, enabled with the KMS key to protect sensitive data. Misconfigured S3 buckets can leak private information to the entire internet or allow unauthorized data tampering or deletion. So that's talking about if you've got public buckets enabled, got issues here like AWS security groups, so unrestricted specific ports. You can see here from the CIDR block, we're basically just saying anyone can just access to and from. Enabling S3 versioning, so we've got easy recovery from any unintended user actions like deletes and overwrites. And then a medium issue here, which is just enable logging. So if we start off by going into our S3 bucket here on line 9 and changing this to private, if I clear the terminal and re-verify, we can see that we get rid of one of those issues. If we tackle this security group's unrestricted specific ports, we can see here the CIDR block. That doesn't look particularly good. If we go ahead and change that to a more designated block and re-verify, you can see that we've got rid of that issue. So the idea here is we're kind of teaching you through repetition, like what to notice, what to think about when you're writing infrastructure as code, and how it should look. So the third, another issue here, enabling S3 versioning will enable easy recovery from both intended user actions like deletes and overrides. We can see that it says here line 9, so we know it's referring to this resource. We can quite easily go in here, type in versioning, and enabled equals true. We verify, and we get rid of that. I know I'm doing this bit by bit, but I assume when you do this lab, rather than going in and trying to tackle all the issues at once, I would probably advise you doing it how I'm doing it here, so like bite-sized chunks to make sure you're not making it more difficult for yourself. The last issue here we have is ensure that S3 buckets have server-side encryption at rest enabled with a KMS key to protect sensitive data. As you can see here, we've already created an AWS KMS key, so you don't have to do that as part of the lab, but you do have to. You can reference this in your server-side encryption at rest. So inside line 9 again, which it references here on the issue, we can go down. We can type in server-side encryption config. We can type in rule, and we can say. I'm just going to copy it to prevent me typing this out. So we can say apply server-side encryption at rest by default, and we can set the algorithm to AES256. I think I just bodged that, sorry. Cool, so that's got rid of that. We've added server-side encryption at rest. We've got rid of all of our high issues. The infrastructure code is looking a lot better now. We've definitely hardened it. We've added server-side encryption. We've enabled versioning on our S3 buckets. We've cleaned up the security group, so it's no longer just open to the internet. And the last thing we need to do is ensure that S3 buckets have logging enabled. Again, that's really easy to do with Terraform. We just need to add a logging resource, and we want to make the target bucket this one here. So we've, again, like the KMS key, we've pre-created a bucket for you called log bucket. So you don't need to add that yourself. You just need to reference it. So we just need to type in data.aws s3 bucket, which refers to that log bucket, and then the ID. Go ahead and verify. So that's all of the issues completed from the security scanner. The last thing we've got here is one of our internal scanners saying that you're missing a description in the AWS security group resource. This isn't necessarily a security risk. This isn't really sort of hardening your code, but it's definitely, I would say, following best practices. So if we go in and add, so it says here group A, we can see we've got an AWS security group here called group A. Just to add a description, web ingress, verify, and we get a token. Then we just need to go to our tasks and complete the lab. The task panel does explain what you need to do. So it does say, review the errors reported by Terrascan, Terraform validate, and our custom validator to discover insecure configurations in the Terraform code, and then utilize the information provided and the linked Terraform documentation for the AWS provider. So it's probably something I should have mentioned, that you can go to the docs here, which will explain all of that. So if we submit that, we complete the lab, and that is AWS episode 1 completed. They are dynamic tokens, so if you just try to copy that token from the webinar, then it's not going to work. So if we jump into AWS episode 2, this one's a little bit different. So rather than focusing on buckets and things like that, we give a focus on AWS KMS keys. So we look into more of that and looking into EBS volumes, so storage volumes in AWS, and how best to deploy those through Terraform. And again, kind of like learning through repetition, teaching you what you should be looking out for when you're writing this stuff. I'm sure a lot of you who are using Terraform potentially have a CI/CD process where you do scan the Terraform for these sort of issues before you are deploying it in your environments. But I know from experience that isn't always the case, and it's normally just people writing Terraform and iterating on it rather than knowing what's wrong and going from experience. So hopefully by doing these labs, it will give you that knowledge of what you should be looking out for when you're writing Terraform, and also the issues that can come from it. So if we look at episode 2, you can see here the Terraform we provide is a little bit different to the last lab. We're looking at KMS keys here, but the premise of it is the same. You go ahead and click verify, and it will return some issues. This looks like there's only one issue, but trust me, once you solve that issue, more issues will pop up. But I'm not going to complete this lab on the webinar. That is for everyone else to complete. So if we go back, again, episode 3, actually, do you know what? I think you guys get the gist of those AWS ones. If we drop into Azure, we go into episode 1. Again, from what I was showing you before with the AWS labs, this is pretty much exactly the same. The only difference is we're going to be using the Terraform provider for Azure. So the resources will be named differently, and the process of hardening it will be different, obviously, because the naming conventions are different and it's a different platform. But the process of going from your Terraform to verifying it to completing the lab will be the same. So if we have a look at this, as you can see, it looks a little bit different to the AWS ones, but the premise is the same. So you click verify, we give you some issues, give you line numbers. You go there, read the documentation, understand why it's vulnerable, and fix it and complete the lab. And they are, let's go back. These labs are the same as the AWS ones, so they build upon each other. So episode 1 is very basic. Well, when I say basic, I mean the resources you're going to be using are basic. And then episode 2 and episode 3 builds upon that, adds in cryptographic keys and things like that, how you secure storage, etc. And we also have GCP. So again, exactly the same, except we're using GCP. So whichever one you're used to, whichever one you use day to day, or potentially whichever one you want to learn more about, then we've got that covered. We are continuously adding to this. So at the moment, you may say, oh, there's only 4 episodes. You do them, you learn a lot, but you say, I want to learn some other parts of AWS that I deploy through Terraform, which I'm not so sure about. We will continuously add to it. So this is just the beginning for these sort of labs. So the next thing, I'm looking at the time, I realize may have been going over slightly. Looking at the other series I wanted to cover is container hardening. Again, if you're using containers in your day-to-day job, or you're looking at using container technologies, the idea behind this series is to teach you how to correctly harden containers and the errors or the issues to look out for. So the common misconfigurations you often see. When I used to be an infrastructure engineer years ago, running your web apps in a container as the root user was something you'd see all the time, and it's probably something it's still happening today. Looking out for things like that, ports, operating system settings and things like that. That's what we're looking at. Again, similar to the Terraform series, we start off with an introductory lab on containers, which will just give you kind of like a base understanding of what containers are, what they're used for, and common misconfigurations before going into container hardening, which looks into more detail, security risks of using containers, and introducing different hardening concepts to you. Hardening the underlying host to reduce your security exposure, etc. But I'm not going to go into those labs. Once you've completed those two, we've then got 3 practical labs. These follow the same process as the Terraform labs, as in instead of Terraform, we're giving you a Dockerfile. And these 3 labs are slightly different. Trivy and Trivy 2 are using a well-known Docker scanner called Trivy. That's the scanner we use to verify if the Dockerfile is appropriately hardened. It's worth mentioning that that lab uses static analysis of the Dockerfile, so we don't actually build it, but Docker, which is a really cool lab, we do actually build it and deploy it and test the vulnerabilities. So that's one of my favorite labs. It's really cool. But if we quickly drop into Trivy, I'll just give you a quick example of what this lab looks like. So the info panel, similar to the Terraform series, we kind of give you a recap of Docker. Again, if you're new to using containers, but you wanted to know more about it, or if you're kind of a container veteran, we kind of just go over basic Docker instructions. The instructions you're going to probably see in the lab. And then we go over the different scanners that we use in the lab. So Trivy by Aquasec and Hatherlint. Similar to the Terraform labs, we also have our own scanner that we use. This is to test some security issues that these scanners don't find, but also to ensure that the Docker file that you're verifying hasn't been tampered with, so you haven't just deleted half of it. We expect the Docker file to contain various commands in it. So as you can see here on the left, we've got the Docker file. It's kind of doesn't make sense if you read it. Like, this just looks weird, but again, I've seen some strange Docker files. This one here is pulling from Alpine. It's exposing some ports, running 2 commands, which is strange, and then is also pulling from Ubuntu, setting the root user, which is bad, and setting a health check. So if we verify this, you can see immediately we get a load of results. It's not a very good Docker file. And you can go through them line by line, similar to the Terraform labs, working your way through it kind of bite size, understanding what each issue is and why it's an issue, and then fixing it, hardening a Docker file, and then getting the token at the end. So if we look at the top one here, Unix ports outside the range 0 to 65535. So immediately we can see there on line 4, we've got exposed 65536. Which is not a port. It's weird. If we just change that to 65535 and re-verify, actually, let me clear the terminal so it's actually clear. You can see we get rid of that issue. So that's essentially the premise of that lab. I'm not going to complete it fully for you. That's for you to go and have fun doing. But at the end of the lab, you'll get a dynamic token similar to the Terraform labs, and you fill in the token here, and it will complete the lab. And the tasks, again, just talking you through what to do in the lab. The buttons are exactly the same as the Terraform demo. You've got reset to reset your Docker file, verify to obviously verify the Docker file, and then clear terminal to clear this window to make it more presentable if you're trying to read information. So if I quickly go back to container hardening, Trivy 2, again, building upon the knowledge that you've picked up in the previous lab. We do link back to episode 1 here, just in case you launched the wrong one. Again, just giving you a quick recap, going through some Docker best practices. So using versioned base images, etc. Just going to wait for the lab to load a second. Again, if you've got any questions, feel free to pop them into the questions panel. So yeah, same premise. Dockerfile. It's a bit different to the previous episode. We go ahead and verify. We get a lot of different issues. So yeah, and that is episode 2. I'm not going to show Dockle just because the load time on it is slightly longer than the trivia episodes. But again, this is similar to the Trivia Labs, except it's dynamic. So we're actually going to be running and deploying the container and testing it. So as I said before, we will be constantly adding to these series. So we'll be building upon what we've already gone through in the current episodes. So do stay tuned for that. And yeah, I realize I missed a slide here, but I've kind of already talked about all of this. So container security, obviously, what are we doing it for? Obviously, we want protection and integrity of our containers. We want to look after the runtime host. We want to check the users it's being run as, and we want to protect the application layer. Why are we doing it? Obviously, we want containers to be appropriately hardened. We want to reduce the attack surface and enforcing defense in depth, which is something that quite a big advocate for with containers. Obviously, if you've got a web app being hosted on your container and the web app has remote code execution, you don't want the user to then be root with that remote code execution. You want to have a defense in depth there. And who is it aimed at? Same as Terraform, infrastructure as code. So developers, security engineers, but anyone really working with containers, which nowadays is a lot of people. And that is that. We do have a question. Yeah, sure. So the question is, which configurations were missed by the open source tools? To be honest, they do cover a lot of the actual security issues. The things we found they were missing were what we would call informational issues. So as you saw in the Terraform lab, like adding a description to your security group, for example, like things like that. That doesn't get picked up by a lot of the scanners because they don't see it as a security issue, but it's not following best practice. And from a Immersive Labs point of view, you know, teaching the security best practice, but also, hey, your security group should probably have a description. Is quite important. And I've seen a lot of Terraform, a lot of infrastructure as code where there's no documentation and there's no descriptions on what any of these resources are doing. So when it comes down to either doing a security audit or validating why they exist, you don't know, right? And so they may just lie there forever and you don't know why they're there. Just keep them there as legacy, whatever. So things like that. There were some other ones too, but again, they're more what we call informational issues. So hopefully that answers your questions. Our scanner also, as I said before, as well as catching those extra issues, it also validates that the Terraform and the Docker files are valid. So checking that you haven't deleted half the Docker file or added some weird stuff in there to try and complete the lab. So that is the end of the presentation. If you do have a license, please log into the platform, give them a go. Again, cloud security is something that we're really focusing on quite a lot at the moment, and you're going to see a lot of labs coming out over the next 12 months to do with cloud security. I don't want to give anything away, as we'll have webinars to show that off and a lot of blogs, etc. But please do stay tuned, and we will be adding more labs to the series that I've demoed today. So if this sort of stuff interests you, then we'll be adding more to it in the future. If you don't have a license and you can't check these labs, then feel free to book a demo. And the next webinar will be by my colleague Ben, going over WinDebug, I believe. So yeah, make sure that you sign up to that one. But thanks everyone for attending. Yeah, and I hope you enjoy the labs.